Daniel Carter was exhausted. It had been a long day at work, and all he wanted was to get home, take off his shoes, and relax. The city streets were wet from the rain, the headlights of passing cars reflecting off the puddles. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting at a red light. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, a soaking wet German shepherd ran into the street. The dog looked terrified. His fur was matted with mud, his ribs slightly visible under his thick coat. He darted between cars, his ears pinned back. Before Daniel could react, the dog leaped straight through his open passenger window. Daniel gasped. The dog landed on the seat beside him, panting heavily. He was shaking from the cold and from fear. For a second, the two of them just stared at each other, man and dog, equally shocked. "What the?" Daniel blurted out. Then he heard shouting. Down the street, two men were running toward him. One of them held a thick rope, the other a wooden stick. They were yelling angrily. "There he is," one of them shouted. The German shepherd whimpered and pressed himself against Daniel's side. He didn't bark or growl. He just looked up at Daniel with desperate, pleading eyes. Daniel's instincts screamed at him. Something wasn't right. These men weren't just looking for a lost pet. They looked angry, dangerous. The light turned green. Daniel made a split-second decision. He slammed his foot on the gas, speeding away before the men could reach the car. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The men were still running, waving their arms, but soon they disappeared into the rainy night. His heart pounded. What had he just done? He looked at the dog beside him. The shepherd's chest rose and fell rapidly, but his eyes softened. He licked Daniel's arm once, as if saying thank you. Daniel sighed. "Well, buddy, now what?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but he didn't look like he planned to leave either. Daniel's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he drove down the empty streets. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets, making it hard to see much beyond the glow of his headlights. The dog, now sitting calmly in the passenger seat, didn't move. His eyes remained focused on Daniel, as if he was trying to communicate something, but Daniel couldn't figure out what it was. They reached a small park. The only sound was the tapping of rain against the windshield. Daniel pulled the car over to the curb and turned off the engine. He needed a moment to think. What had just happened? "All right, boy," Daniel said softly, turning to the dog. "What's your story?" The German shepherd just stared back, his ears flicking at the sound of Daniel's voice. His coat was still wet, and he looked cold. But there was something noble about him, like he wasn't just any stray. This dog was different. Suddenly, Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang on the passenger side of the car. Daniel jumped, his heart racing. He quickly looked around, his eyes wide. There was no one in sight. He hadn't seen any other cars or people in the area. Where did the sound come from? And then he heard it, a faint shouting sound. It was hard to make out, but it was coming from the direction where the two men had been chasing the dog earlier. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. They were still out there. The men had followed him. They must have seen where he parked. He looked over at the dog, who was now standing up, his body tense. The shepherd's ears were perked, and his eyes were focused on the park. Daniel followed the dog's gaze but saw nothing. He wasn't sure what to do next. Should he drive away? Should he call the police? But then he remembered the way the men had looked at the dog, the anger in their eyes. They didn't seem like normal animal control officers, or even just people looking for a missing pet. No, there was something else, something darker. Suddenly, the German shepherd barked once, low and loud, breaking the silence. Daniel jumped again. "What's wrong, boy?" he muttered, his voice shaky. The dog's body was now fully alert, his head swiveling from side to side. He barked again, and then he stared straight ahead, his tail stiff, his eyes narrowed. Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. This wasn't a normal dog. This wasn't a dog just lost or scared. This was a dog with a purpose, a dog that was used to being in control. Without thinking, Daniel unlocked the doors and stepped out of the car. He didn't want to be trapped inside with whatever was out there. He looked around, but the park was dark and empty, nothing but shadows and the soft rustling of trees in the wind. Then he heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer, too close. His breath caught in his throat. Daniel stepped back toward the car, ready to jump in and drive off. But as he turned to reach for the door, he saw the two men emerging from the shadows, walking straight toward him. The dog growled, a deep, low sound that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. "Stay back," Daniel shouted, his voice trembling but firm. The men didn't stop. Instead, they smiled, their eyes glinting in the dark. "We just want the dog," one of the men said. "Hand him over, and no one gets hurt." But the dog wasn't backing down. He stepped forward, his hackles raised. Daniel could see it now. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting Daniel too. Daniel's heart was racing. The two men were still moving toward him, their steps slow and deliberate, like they were hunting something. He could feel the tension building in the air. The rain had stopped, but the wet streets shimmered under the dim glow of streetlights, casting long shadows around them. He looked at the German shepherd, who was standing in front of him now, growling softly. The dog's eyes never left the men. It was as if he could sense their every move before they made it. "Stay back," Daniel shouted again, but his voice was shaking this time. He wasn't sure what to do. If these men wanted the dog that badly, then something wasn't right. They didn't look like ordinary dog catchers. There was no way they were just looking for a lost pet. One of the men smirked, his voice cold. "You really don't want to make this harder, friend." Daniel's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to the men. The German shepherd didn't seem scared at all. In fact, he looked more like a guardian, a protector who had been through situations like this before. He wasn't acting like a lost street dog. He was acting like he had a mission. "Listen, I don't know who you guys are," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice calm, "but I'm not giving you the dog. You can leave now, and we won't have any problems." The men stopped. One of them, the taller one with a thick beard, chuckled darkly. "We're not asking, friend." Before Daniel could react, the dog lunged forward. Axel, as Daniel had started calling him, was fast. His movements were controlled and precise. With a loud bark, he charged at the men, his teeth bared, his body coiled like a spring. The men took a step back, clearly not expecting such a strong reaction from a dog they thought was just a stray. Daniel froze. He had never seen anything like this. Axel wasn't just defending himself. He was fighting to protect Daniel. The shorter man raised his hand, reaching for something in his pocket. Daniel didn't wait to see what it was. He grabbed Axel by the collar and pulled him back, just in time to hear the sharp click of a gun being cocked. "Stay out of this, boy," the bearded man growled, his eyes narrowing at the dog. "This doesn't concern you." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A gun. They weren't here just for a dog. They were here for something much worse. But what? And why would they want a German shepherd so badly? Axel's growl deepened, and his eyes stayed locked on the men, never once looking away. Daniel could feel the dog's loyalty, like there was no question in Axel's mind about what he had to do. Daniel was his responsibility now. The bearded man took another step forward, but this time, Axel didn't move. Instead, he barked loudly once again, the sound echoing down the empty street. The men hesitated, unsure of what to do next. That's when Daniel made his move. He grabbed the door handle of the car and yanked it open. "Get in," he shouted to Axel, his voice loud and desperate. Axel didn't hesitate. He leaped into the car and landed in the passenger seat, his eyes still fixed on the men. Daniel slammed the door shut and rushed around to the driver's side. As he got in and started the engine, He saw the two men exchange frustrated looks. "You won't get away with this," the taller man yelled as Daniel hit the gas, speeding away. Daniel didn't look back. He just drove. His heart was still pounding in his chest. What had just happened? The men had seemed so certain, so dangerous. Why would they want Axel so badly? As the cars sped through the wet streets, Daniel glanced at the dog in the passenger seat. Axel's eyes softened just a little, but he didn't wag his tail or move closer. He just stared ahead, focused. Daniel took a deep breath. Whatever was going on, Axel had chosen him. And now, they were in this together. The night was quiet as Daniel drove through the city. The streetlights flickered as he made his way home, trying to calm his nerves. His hand still gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts racing. Who were those men? And why did they want Axel so badly? The more Daniel thought about it, the more he felt like there was something big he was missing. Axel sat quietly in the passenger seat, his head resting on the door as if he were relaxed. But Daniel knew better. The dog's ears were still alert, and his eyes kept scanning their surroundings. It was as though Axel knew something Daniel didn't. "Hey boy," Daniel said, glancing over at the dog. "You're one smart pup, aren't you?" Axel gave a soft bark and wagged his tail for the first time since they'd met. It was small, almost like a thank you, but it made Daniel smile. At least the dog seemed to trust him. That was something. When they got home, Daniel parked the car in the driveway and sat for a moment, lost in thought. The sky above was clear, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. He looked over at Axel, who was still watching him closely. "Well, this is your new home for now," Daniel said with a tired smile. "Let's see what we can figure out." He got out of the car and opened the door for Axel. The dog stepped out slowly, his paws hitting the pavement with quiet, confident steps. He seemed at ease now, even though Daniel had no idea where they'd go from here. Inside, Daniel made a quick call to a friend. His name was Tom, and he worked at the local police station. Daniel had known him for years, but they hadn't spoken much lately. Still, this wasn't something Daniel could figure out on his own. He needed help. "Tom, it's Daniel. I've got a weird situation here. I found a dog, a German Shepherd. I think someone's after him. They're dangerous." Tom was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean, dangerous? You just found a dog. I'm telling you, this is no ordinary dog. He's been trained. And those men, something's not right. I think they're involved in something illegal." All right. Slow down," Tom said. "Tell me everything." Daniel explained what had happened, how the dog had jumped into his car, how the men had chased them, and how Axel had reacted. When Daniel finished, Tom was silent again. "I think I know who you're talking about," he said finally. "There's been talk around here about some shady people in the area. They've been looking for a K9, one that went missing a while ago. No one knew what happened to him. A K9. But why would anyone want him?" Daniel asked, confused. "They probably didn't just want the dog for no reason," Tom explained. "This K9, he was part of a police unit. A good dog, but something happened to his handler. The case went cold. There were rumors, but nothing solid." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Axel had been a police dog. That was why he seemed so different, so trained, so focused. But if Axel had been a part of a police unit, what had happened to his handler? And why were people after him now? "Do you think Axel's connected to his handler's death?" Daniel asked. "I don't know yet," Tom replied. "But I'll do some digging. You should be careful. If those men are after the dog, they might be involved in something bigger than you realize." "I will," Daniel said, his mind racing. "Thanks, Tom. I'll keep you updated." After hanging up, Daniel looked at Axel, who had been sitting quietly by the door, watching him the whole time. The dog seemed calmer now. But the more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized that Axel wasn't just a stray. He was part of something much bigger. and he had just become part of Daniel's world. "I'm going to find out what happened, Axel," Daniel whispered, "and I won't let anyone hurt you." Axel gave a soft bark, as if he understood. And somehow, Daniel felt that Axel trusted him. They were in this together. The days after Daniel's phone call with Tom were filled with worry. The sense of danger seemed to grow with each passing hour. Axel, though calm and loyal, was still an enigma to Daniel. The more he thought about the dog's past, the more questions he had. Why was Axel running from those men? And why had they wanted him so badly? Daniel spent hours searching for information, digging through news articles and police reports. What he found only deepened the mystery. There had been a missing police dog, a German shepherd named Axel, who had been part of a special unit. But the report said nothing about what had happened to him. The case had gone cold, with no one knowing where Axel had disappeared to or why. One evening, after another frustrating day of searching, Daniel decided it was time to take the next step. He knew he had to talk to Maria Rivera, the widow of Officer Mark Rivera, Axel's original handler. She might have the answers he was looking for. Maria lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, far from the busy city streets. When Daniel arrived at her house, he felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. He wasn't sure how to start the conversation, or if she would even want to talk about her husband's death. But this was important. He rang the doorbell, and after a moment, Maria opened the door. She was a woman in her early 40s, her face worn with grief, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. "Hi, Maria," Daniel said, his voice gentle. "I'm Daniel Carter. I know this is going to sound strange, but I think I found your husband's dog." Maria's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I found Axel," Daniel explained. "He showed up at my car a few days ago, and now there are people after him, people who want him back. I think they might be the reason he disappeared in the first place." Maria looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. "Come inside," she said quietly. "We need to talk." They sat down in the small living room, and Maria poured them both cups of tea. She took a deep breath before she spoke. "I've been waiting for this day, but I never thought it would come like this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Mark, he was a good officer, and Axel was more than just a dog to him. They were partners. When Mark died, I thought I lost everything. But now, you're saying Axel's still out there?" Daniel nodded. "I think Axel's been through a lot since then. But I don't understand why he was missing or why people are after him." Maria's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly, taking another breath before continuing. "Mark was part of a special unit. They were investigating something big, something dangerous. It wasn't just criminals, Daniel. There were people within the police force who were involved. Mark found out things he shouldn't have. And that's when Axel disappeared." Daniel's stomach dropped. Corruption within the police force. Was that what this was all about? Maria went on, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "I don't have all the details, but Mark's death wasn't an accident. He was killed because of what he uncovered. Axel must have seen something that could bring down the people who did it." Daniel's mind raced. Axel wasn't just a dog. He was a witness, and maybe he held the key to solving Mark Rivera's death. "So those men," Daniel began, "they're involved in whatever happened to Mark," Maria finished for him. "And they've been looking for Axel ever since. He's a threat to them. If they can get him back, they'll make sure no one ever finds out the truth." Daniel sat back, shocked. He had no idea what he was up against. But one thing was clear now. Axel's past was far darker than he could have imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. "Maria, we need to keep Axel safe. He's the only one who can help bring justice for your husband," Daniel said, his voice firm. Maria nodded, her eyes filled with both grief and hope. "I know, Daniel, and I'm with you. We're in this together now." As Daniel looked at Axel, who was quietly sitting by the door, he knew this was no longer just a matter of protecting the dog. It was a fight for the truth, a fight for justice, and he was going to help Axel win it. The rain had started again, heavy and steady, as if the sky were reflecting the heaviness of the moment. Daniel sat in his car, parked a few blocks from Maria's house. His mind was spinning with everything he had just learned. Axel, the dog he had taken in, wasn't just a lost animal. He was a key piece in a deadly game. A game that started long before Daniel ever met him. The people who were chasing Axel were part of something much bigger than just wanting a missing dog back. There were dangerous secrets, and Axel had seen too much. He was a living witness to corruption. And now, those who wanted to keep their dark secrets hidden were going to stop at nothing to get him back. Daniel glanced over at Axel, who was curled up in the passenger seat. The dog hadn't moved much since they left Maria's house, his eyes still alert but tired, as if he were waiting for something. "Are you okay, boy?" Daniel asked softly, turning to look at him. Axel turned his head, his dark eyes locking with Daniel's, as if answering him. For the first time since they'd met, Axel gave a quiet, almost reassuring wag of his tail. It was as if Axel understood what Daniel was thinking, that he was in this too. Together, they would uncover the truth. Daniel started the car, the engine's hum cutting through the silence. He had to figure out his next move. The threat was growing. The men who had been chasing Axel were still out there. And Maria had confirmed what he feared. They would stop at nothing to silence Axel. But there was something else Daniel knew. The people after Axel weren't just dangerous. They were organized. They had been looking for Axel for a long time, and they had the resources to track him down. They weren't going to let him slip through their fingers again. Daniel needed a plan. He needed to get ahead of them before it was too late. "Let's go, Axel," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. "We've got work to do." He drove out of the neighborhood and into the city, his mind racing. He needed to find a way to keep Axel safe, but first, he had to find out everything he could about the people after him. He needed answers. When he got home, Daniel went straight to his computer. He started searching for anything he could find about Officer Mark Rivera's death, about the special unit he had been part of, and about the mysterious people who had been looking for Axel. Hours passed, but the more Daniel searched, the more questions he had. The deeper he dug, the more it became clear that the investigation wasn't just about corruption within the police force. It was about something far more dangerous, a criminal network that reached deeper than anyone could have imagined. And Axel, it seemed, had been at the center of it all. He had been trained to track, to sniff out the truth, and to protect his handler, Officer Rivera. But Axel had seen more than anyone realized. He had been a part of something no one wanted exposed. And now, the people who had killed Rivera wanted Axel back to make sure their secrets stayed buried. Daniel ran a hand through his hair in frustration. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had enough to know that Axel was in grave danger. And if he didn't act fast, those men would catch up to them. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tom, his police officer friend. "Daniel, I found something. It's bad. They're moving in on your location. Be careful. I've got a team on standby, but you need to leave now. They know where you are." Daniel's heart raced. He grabbed Axel's leash and pulled it on, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't have much time. "Come on, boy," he muttered, as Axel jumped up, his body tense but ready. They had to move quickly. Axel's life, and Daniel's, was in danger. And if they didn't act fast, they wouldn't make it out alive. The plan was simple: get out of town, leave the city behind, and disappear for a while. Daniel had no idea where they would go, but he didn't have a choice. He couldn't stay where the enemy could find them. As he started the car and pulled out of the driveway, Daniel glanced at Axel, who was sitting up, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "I don't know what's coming, Axel," Daniel said softly, "but we're going to make it through this. Together." Axel turned his head slightly and looked at Daniel, as if to say, "I'm ready." And in that moment, Daniel knew he wasn't alone in this fight. They had each other, and that was enough. The car sped down the empty road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel's hands were tight on the wheel, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. They were on the run, and every second counted. Axel, sitting quietly in the passenger seat, was alert but calm. His dark eyes never left Daniel, as if reassuring him that they were in this together. Daniel could feel the dog's focus. Axel was ready for whatever came next. Tom's warning echoed in his mind. "They're moving in on your location." Those words made Daniel's heart race even faster. If the men chasing them were already close, it wouldn't be long before they caught up. As the miles passed, Daniel's thoughts raced. Where could he go? He had no real plan. He just needed to get out of the city, far from the people who wanted Axel. But where? The only place he could think of was the old cabin his family owned, a small place in the woods. It wasn't much, but it was out of the way, and it was safe. For now. "Hold on, Axel," Daniel said quietly, glancing over at the dog. "We're going to the cabin. It's our best chance." Axel let out a soft whine, almost like he understood the urgency of the situation. The dog's body was tense, but he didn't bark or move. He just sat there, eyes fixed on Daniel, like a partner on a mission. As Daniel made his way toward the cabin, he noticed something in the distance, a set of headlights in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. It was them. They had found him. The car behind him started gaining speed, its headlights growing larger in the mirror. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He couldn't outrun them, not with Axel in the car. He had to think fast. He swerved off the main road and onto a smaller, winding path through the trees. The car behind him followed, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel knew the path well. It was narrow, winding, and filled with sharp turns. If he could lose them in the woods, he might stand a chance. But the car behind him wasn't giving up. It was fast, too. Daniel's heart was pounding in his chest as he pushed the gas pedal harder, trying to get ahead. The trees on either side of the road blurred as he sped through the dark forest, the only sound the roar of the engine and the pounding of his own heart. Axel growled softly, his ears back, as though the dog sensed the danger closing in. Daniel could see the headlights behind him growing larger with every second. He needed to do something. Ahead of him, the path split into two. Daniel didn't hesitate. He took the right turn, the wheels of the car screeching as they slid through the wet earth. The headlights behind him followed, but the turn had been sharp enough that the pursuing car struggled to keep up. Daniel's pulse raced as the gap between them widened, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they were back on his tail. He had to get to the cabin, and fast. His mind worked quickly. There was a small creek near the cabin, with a bridge that was barely visible unless you knew where to look. If he could make it there, he could hide the car and escape on foot with Axel. The cabin was small, and no one had been there in years, but it might be their only chance. As he approached the bridge, he took another sharp turn, slowing the car just enough to avoid hitting the rocks on either side. He saw the familiar outline of the bridge ahead. "Almost there," Daniel muttered, his eyes flicking to Axel, who was now sitting up, alert, watching the road ahead with unwavering focus. The dog knew what was at stake, and Daniel felt a renewed sense of determination. The headlights from the pursuing car were still visible in the distance, but they were far behind now. Daniel drove over the bridge and pulled off the road, parking the car next to the trees, out of sight. He turned off the engine, the silence in the woods suddenly deafening. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the soft panting of Axel. "We made it, boy," Daniel whispered, looking at Axel. But the relief was only temporary. They weren't safe yet. The men would come looking for them. It was just a matter of time. Daniel opened the door and stepped out, grabbing Axel's leash. "Stay close," he said, leading the dog toward the cabin. The night was still, but the danger was far from over. They had to be ready for whatever came next. Axel walked beside him, the two of them united in purpose, moving deeper into the woods, where the shadows hid them from the world. The cabin was small and old, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to watch over it like silent guards. Daniel led Axel inside, carefully closing the door behind him. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. It wasn't much, but it was secluded. And for now, that's all that mattered. "We're safe for now," Daniel said, looking at Axel. The dog's ears perked up as if listening, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the cabin. It was as though Axel could sense the danger wasn't over. Daniel sat down on an old chair, running a hand through his hair. He had to think. The men who were after them weren't far behind, and the thought of facing them alone in the dark woods didn't sit well with him. But there was no turning back now. Axel padded over to him, sitting at his feet, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort in the dog's presence. Axel had been through so much, and yet he still remained calm, focused, and loyal. He wasn't just a dog, he was a partner. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the cabin creak. Daniel looked out the window, his heart pounding in his chest. It was quiet, too quiet. He knew it wouldn't be long before the men would find the cabin. They had no choice but to prepare for what was coming. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. The crunch of footsteps on gravel. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The men were close. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and motioned for Axel to follow him. The dog's ears stood at attention, his muscles tensed. They had to move fast. Daniel led Axel out of the cabin and into the woods, the shadows swallowing them whole as they moved through the trees. They stayed low, careful to avoid making any noise. Daniel's heart raced as he glanced back, his breath coming in short bursts. The footsteps were closer now, too close. He could hear the sound of voices, muffled by the distance, but still unmistakable. "They're here," Daniel whispered, his mind working quickly. What would they do next? He could hide, but the men would search the woods. They wouldn't stop until they found Axel. There had to be another way. Then a thought struck him. Tom. He could contact Tom again. Maybe the police could help him, if they knew where he was. But would they make it in time? Daniel pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he tried to dial. But before he could press the call button, Axel suddenly growled low in his throat. The sound was deep and unsettling, and it made Daniel freeze. Axel was always calm, never aggressive, but now something had set him off. "Stay close, Axel," Daniel whispered, holding the dog's leash tightly. The growl deepened, and Daniel's eyes widened. A figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette just outside the trees. The man's face was hidden in the darkness, but Daniel could feel the danger radiating from him. Then another figure appeared, and another. There were at least 3 of them. The men were closing in. Daniel's heart raced. He had to do something. Axel growled again, louder this time, his body tense and ready. Daniel stood up straighter, his hand still on Axel's leash. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going down without a fight. The man in the front spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You can't run forever, Daniel. We'll find you, and we'll take Axel back." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he stood his ground. "I'm not giving him up," he said, his voice steady but firm. The men laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You really think you can stop us?" the leader asked. Axel's growl deepened, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees. Daniel's mind was racing, but he had no more time to think. Then, without warning, Axel lunged forward. The men didn't expect it. They staggered back in surprise as Axel barked, his teeth bared. The dog was fast, agile, and fierce. He wasn't just a pet. He was trained to protect. Daniel didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, grabbing Axel's leash and pulling the dog back to his side. "Get back, Axel," he shouted, but the dog was relentless. He barked again, his body tense, and Daniel could feel the heat of the confrontation building. The men took another step forward, but Axel wasn't backing down, and neither was Daniel. In that moment, Daniel realized something. This wasn't just about saving Axel anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, about not letting the darkness win. And together, with Axel by his side, Daniel was ready to face whatever came next.